All right, so we're back for another deep dive, and today we're looking at something pretty interesting, something kind of specific to the Indian business world.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're looking at alcoholic beverages.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we're going to unpack some recent news about a company called OB Cocktails.
Okay.
Now, they were a ready-to-drink startup, and they had some pretty big names backing them, like Bhavish Aggarwal,
Wow.
and they recently decided to shut down. So that's what we're going to look into today.
Makes sense.
Our main source today is going to be an exclusive report from FinTrack. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, I took a look at that earlier this week.
Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. So we're going to try to understand, why did this venture shut down? It seemed like they had a lot going for them.
Yeah.
So we'll also use this to take a look at the ready-to-drink cocktail market in India and kind of the broader alcoholic beverage landscape.
Sounds good. So where should we start?
Well, I think the news itself is kind of the place to start. So the news came out from the founder and CEO of OB Cocktails, Nitesh Prakash.
All right.
He made this announcement on LinkedIn
Gotcha.
saying that after more than 5 years, they were going to shut down.
Wow, 5 years is a long time.
Yeah, that's not a short amount of time to be in business.
Right.
And his main reason that he gave, and I'm going to quote him directly here, was that they realized the alcobev industry, the alcoholic beverage industry here in India,
Yeah.
is commoditized rather than consumer-backed.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he went on to say that this just did not align with their vision, their idea of offering this premium and convenient cocktail experience, which is what they were going for, right?
Makes sense.
So that's what he said. But 5 years is a pretty considerable amount of time.
Yeah, definitely.
For a startup to be in business for 5 years means that they must have been doing something, right?
You would think so, yeah.
So what do you think about that distinction, that like commoditized versus consumer-backed?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I think what he's trying to say is that they, had trouble building that strong brand identity that really resonates with consumers,
I see.
leading to this situation where people are making buying decisions based on just the price
Oh,
or like
no.
whatever's available, rather than sticking with a brand, being loyal to OB Cocktails.
Gotcha.
And when you think about it, 5 years, that probably means that they did get some market share.
Yeah, they had to, right?
Right. So the fact that they shut down and didn't try, a different strategy is pretty significant.
Yeah. Well, and there's more. So in that same post, Prakash also mentioned that for the past year, they've been trying to find a buyer.
Really.
Yeah, they were hoping that Obey could continue under new ownership.
But I see.
But he said they basically exhausted all their options. Every possibility they looked at for selling the company fell through. So they couldn't find any buyers. I mean, a whole year of trying to sell and nothing. That just seems like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong indicator that something's not quite right.
Yeah.
I mean, that can mean a lot of things, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe the valuation they were asking for was just too high
Okay.
compared to what potential buyers were willing to pay, or, maybe buyers were just worried about how profitable the business model actually was, or, if it was going to be sustainable long-term, especially in this market.
Yeah.
And I mean, even companies that were already in the alcoholic beverage business, maybe even companies looking to get into it,
Right.
maybe they saw some challenges, and that's what made them hesitant, not interested in buying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about, the announcement, the shutdown, the attempt to sell the company, but let's take a look at their finances.
Okay.
Now, OB Cocktails did manage to raise capital
Yeah.
in a couple of rounds, actually.
Oh, right.
So back in August of 2021,
21.
they secured 3.5 crore rupees. This was in an angel round.
Angel round. Okay.
Yeah. Now, for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with how startups work, an angel round is basically the first big chunk of funding that a startup usually gets.
Makes sense.
And it often comes from like individual investors, people who see potential in the company early on and, they want to get in on the ground floor.
Gotcha.
And the investors in this angel round they were impressive.
Ugh.
So you've got First Check, Let's Venture, and then probably the most notable one, Bhavish Aggarwal.
From Ola.
Yeah, from Ola. And then Bhavish Aggarwal, the guy who founded Tracken,
Wow.
and Sprout Investments were in on it too. So that's a pretty big vote of confidence
For sure.
for such an early stage company to have that kind of backing.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right. It's not just the money. It's who those investors are.
Yeah.
They bring so much to the table. Mentorship. They can offer advice on strategy. They have these huge networks.
Right.
So Their involvement really says a lot about how much they believed in Obey and its potential.
Yeah. But the funding didn't stop there.
Really?
Yeah. So later in November of 2023, which was actually not that long before they announced they were closing,
Wow.
they also closed a pre-Series A funding round.
So they were still getting money.
Yeah. Now, the report didn't say how much they raised,
Okay.
but they did say that Inflection Point Ventures led the investment.
I see.
And this just means that people still believed in the company,
Right.
even later in the game,
Yeah.
and then they just shut down. So does that seem kind of weird to you?
It is surprising, yeah.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if something happened, some problem or maybe a bunch of problems like all piled up.
Right.
Even with all that extra money, they just couldn't overcome it.
Right.
And I think it's a good reminder, honestly, that even if a startup looks promising at the beginning,
Yeah.
even if they keep getting investment,
Right.
there's always a risk.
Yeah. Yeah.
You just never know what could happen.
Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk about what OBO was actually selling, what they were putting on the market.
Gotcha.
So they offered, a variety of ready-to-drink cocktails.
Okay.
The FinTracker report mentioned that Oben, they really prided themselves on these cocktails being perfected through over 100 iterations.
Yeah, 100.
Yeah, which is pretty crazy.
That's a lot of iterations.
Yeah, and they emphasized that their cocktails had consistent quality.
I see.
They wanted consumers to know they were getting, the same great taste every time.
Makes sense.
Now their main operational hubs were Goa and Bengaluru,
Okay.
which makes sense, right? Those places have a pretty, I don't know, like a more established drinking culture.
For sure. Yeah.
It's a little bit more, I don't know, I guess acceptable or developed compared to some other parts of India.
Yeah.
That
Totally.
makes sense that they would focus on those places.
Yeah. And, in that ready-to-drink market,
Mm-hmm.
people want convenience, right? But they don't want to have to give up, good taste to get that convenience.
All right.
So focusing on quality, making sure it's consistent, those are really important things for that kind of customer.
Definitely. So, focusing on Goa and Bengaluru, that was strategic.
For sure.
But they didn't just operate in those two places. They were bigger than that.
Okay.
So they were also in business in Bhutan. Have you ever been to Bhutan?
I've never been, no.
It's beautiful, I've heard. It's on my list.
Yeah, maybe one day.
Yeah. So they were in Bhutan, but they were also in 9 other states in India.
Wow. So they really got around.
Yeah, they had a pretty big footprint.
Okay.
And in addition to all of that, they also had this whole distribution network
Okay.
that they set up. It included 22 private distributors.
So like third-party companies.
Yeah, exactly. And they even had 2 government contracts.
Wow. Government contract.
Yeah, pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, very.
And they were saying they had a presence in over 1,700 premium wine shops.
So like high-end places.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's a pretty impressive reach, especially for a startup.
Absolutely. I mean, building that kind of network in India,
Mm-hmm.
it's not easy, especially with all the different rules and regulations in every state.
Yeah, it's a patchwork.
Yeah, you got to put in a lot of work, a lot of investment to make that happen.
Right.
And getting those government contracts, that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
That probably means they were selling through state-run liquor stores,
Yeah, I would imagine so.
which is great, but it comes with its own set of challenges,
Right.
like all the bureaucracy you have to deal with.
Right.
And, the profit margins might not be as good as when you're working with private distributors.
Interesting.
But then on top of that, they were also in all those fancy wine shops.
Yeah, they were really going for a specific kind of customer.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about OB, but let's talk about their competition for a minute.
All right.
So according to the report, there were a bunch of other companies doing similar stuff.
Right.
Companies like Jimmy's Cocktails,
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Gateway Brewing, Bira 91, Medusa. Have you heard of Medusa?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So Obey wasn't alone in this market.
Definitely not. That's a pretty crowded space.
Yeah. And there's actually a really interesting point that Avneet Singh, the founder of Medusa,
Oh, yeah.
he made this point recently about how the alcoholic beverage industry in India
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really get a lot of support, like in terms of making it easier to do business,
Interesting.
even though it brings in so much money for the state governments.
Right.
So it's kind of a weird disconnect.
It is, and that's a really important point to think about. The ready-to-drink market, it is growing. But the rules for alcoholic beverages in India, it's so complicated. It's different in every state.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
It's a total mess.
Yeah.
And all these things, like the licenses, the taxes, the rules about distribution, they make it really hard for these businesses, especially if they're trying to grow and operate in multiple states.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's like, imagine going on a road trip across the U.S., but every state has totally different traffic laws. Okay, yeah.
That's what these companies are dealing with.
So just to be clear, we're not, taking sides here.
Right.
I think it's important to consider this perspective, this point of view from someone who's actually in the industry.
Totally.
Because it might be part of the reason why OB had so much trouble.
Yeah, and even if it wasn't the main reason for OB, it's definitely a challenge for the whole industry.
For sure.
And, how easy or difficult it is to do business, that can really impact a company's growth.
Definitely.
It can affect their ability to make a profit and just survive.
Okay, so we've gone over a lot of information.
Yeah, we have.
But I think it's important for our listeners to understand, why should you care about this?
Right.
Why does the story of OB cocktails matter?
A good point.
Well, if you're interested in the Indian business world, especially in dynamic industries like alcoholic beverages,
right,
then this is a really good example of what can happen.
For sure.
It's a startup that had a lot of support, a seemingly great product.
And they still couldn't make it work.
Exactly. And it's that contrast, right, between all that excitement and investment at the beginning and then ultimately having to shut down.
Right.
It shows just how hard it is for startups.
Even in markets that seem like they have a ton of potential.
Totally. And it reminds us that we can't just focus on the hype. We have to look at the reality of the market, the economics, the regulations, all of it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really interesting going back to that statement that the founder made.
About it being commoditized.
Yeah, that the industry is more commoditized than consumer-backed,
Right.
That's a pretty thought-provoking statement.
Yeah, definitely.
And what I think he's getting at is that maybe, just maybe, in the ready-to-drink cocktail market in India, it's actually a lot harder than people think to build that strong brand loyalty and to really position yourself as a premium product.
That makes sense.
It makes you wonder, are people in India really just looking at convenience and price when they buy these cocktails?
Possibly, yeah.
More than a specific brand.
Yeah, and if that's the case, if consumers see these ready-to-drink cocktails as just, a commodity,
right,
then it becomes so much harder to convince them to pay more for a certain brand.
Yeah.
Just because it's supposed to be premium,
right.
You have to really sell them on it, You need a really compelling story. You need to show them why your product is worth that extra money.
Yeah, and you have to show them why it's different.
Exactly.
And it makes you think about OB and their 100 iterations.
Right.
Did that really matter to the average customer?
Good question.
Did they even notice?
It's hard to say.
All right, so let's wrap this up.
All right.
We spent a lot of time on OBO cocktails.
We have.
We talked about their closure, their failed attempts to find a buyer.
Right.
All that money they raised.
A lot of money.
The investors, the products, their market presence, all that stuff.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
And we even looked at the competition and the whole regulatory landscape for alcoholic beverages in India.
Totally.
And I think what we see here with Obsessi is a really valuable case study.
I agree.
It shows just how complicated the ready-to-drink market is in India.
Absolutely.
I mean, they had everything going for them.
It seemed like it.
The money, the reach, a decent product, but it still wasn't enough.
Right, and that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, could this be a sign of something bigger? Like a trend we're seeing in consumer goods markets.
Okay.
Especially in industries with lots of regulations.
Yeah.
Like, what if premium and convenient, what if that's just not enough anymore?
That's a good question.
What else do you need to succeed?
Yeah. What are those other factors?
Right, like maybe you need a really, really specific brand strategy, or maybe you need to change up your distribution, adapt to how things work in India.
Right.
And then there's the regulations. They're always changing.
Yeah.
So you got to stay on top of that too.
Yeah. So much to think about. All right. That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.